Another project the board's working on is kind of looking at the future of archaeology and our role in it in these changing times. So we've sent out some emails to various people that we know and respect in OAS and the general archaeological community. Actually, the board just spoke with Virginia Butler here for about 45 minutes before this meeting. So we're just trying to collect input at this point from various people on how we can serve you guys and serve the archaeological community in the future, build relationships within the community, and just move forward a little bit. So next month's speakers are going to be Joanna Tuck and Michelle Punk. I'm not sure, I'm probably butchering that, but it's going to be an archaeological representation of urban Asian and Asian American communities in early Portland, 1860 to 1920. So that should be really good. And oh, one last reminder, membership dues. They were officially due January 1st, but we will still take your money gladly. Anyway, it supports a lot of great enterprises like the Jones Scholarship, the Lawrence Scholarship, the school field trips that we hope to get back to next fall. So there are a lot of things, there are monthly presentations. They've gone to support that in the past. So your membership does a lot for the organization, and we just really appreciate those. So what you really came here for tonight, not to listen to me talk, what you want to hear is Melissa Darby. Melissa is an affiliated research faculty member in the anthropology department at Portland State University. She's also the principal investigator and sole proprietor of Lower Columbia Research and Archaeology. She has over 30 years experience as an archaeologist and historian in the Northwest, and is a noted authority on the ethnohistory of Native peoples of the Lower Columbia. Now, aside from that, I have to say that Melissa has been a great friend to us at Basic Training, helping us with programs. I was delighted to have a chance to work with her in the field a little bit last spring with Kimberly Fitzgerald's project down in Salem with the Jason Lee House. She's a delightful person, extremely knowledgeable, and I'm really excited to have Melissa talking tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa.
Well, thank you so much, David. I want to share the screen, so I will do this, and I will do this, view, recenter view. Aha. Can you all see? Can anybody see?
We can see.
Yep. Okay. All right. Thank you, David. Thanks everyone for coming to this virtual talk tonight. It's been over a year that I've wanted to present this to you, and I'm really glad I'm here. Finally, Kathy knows. So I've been working on trying to figure out where Drake landed and the whole background to his voyage for about 9 or 10 years. And I came across a few interesting things, and it just drove me to find out more and more and more. It's, you know, when you have this undying curiosity, sometimes you just have to go with it. So that's what I did. And so this is the culmination of that. And it's also in my book. Anyway, so without any further ado, let's talk about Drake and the Golden Hind. This is the Golden Hind. It was taking on water on a summer's day in 1579. The stormy seas off the northwest coast of America had widened her seams and made the leak worse, the leak that she'd had since she was off the coast of Panama. and Francis Drake, who only became Sir Francis after this voyage, and his crew were searching the rough coast for a well-protected cove so that they could careen it over on its side and get to the leak, because the leak was really along the keel, and there was no way they could half careen it and get to it. And they needed a sandy beach with a shallow gradual line that goes up to the beach. And complicating her predicament, the ship was heavy with captured silver and bullion. In fact, she was ballasted with Peruvian silver. Can you imagine? They had begun their voyage in December of 1577 when Francis Drake and his fleet of 5 ships left from Plymouth. The crew thought they were heading to Alexandria. But soon after they sailed, it was revealed that their destination was the South Pacific and then places north to look for the Northwest Passage. The voyage became known as the Famous Voyage, and it was the second circumnavigation of the Earth and the first to return with its commander, Drake. However famous it was, the Famous Voyage has always been shrouded in mystery. Upon his return, but even before he could get out of the Golden Hind in the harbor of Plymouth, a messenger rode out to him and said that he was in the Queen's bad graces and the Spanish ambassador was asking for restitution for all the things that he had stolen. Subsequently, the crew was made to swear an oath of secrecy, not to reveal where they had traveled on pain of death. Drake was disavowed. They called him a pirate in public, and the Privy Council initiated a so-called official investigation into the voyage. This was all a cover story. Drake was a hero. Within a week of his return, Queen Elizabeth quietly summoned him to court and told him that he had nothing to fear, and she confiscated his logs and charts and met with him for over 12 hours. He was knighted a few months later, and sadly, his records of the voyage have never surfaced because the Queen kept him to her own, and they probably were destroyed in a fire after she died. Now, there are 2 persistent questions regarding Francis Drake's exploration of the west coast of America. How far north did the Golden Hind sail? And where was the geographical location of this fair and good bay where he careened the ship and spent either 5 or 10 weeks, that it's not very clear, during the summer of 1579? So those are the 2 main questions that I did research on. The treasure they unloaded at this beach was astonishing. One inventory described 650 ingots of silver weighing nearly 23,000 pounds, that's 11 tons, 36 parcels of gold ingots and cakes weighing over 100 pounds. There were Peruvian emeralds and a huge quantity of pearls, some of great value, as well as 4 crates of Chinese porcelains, a quantity of fine clothing, and bolts of fine cloth. So they rested in this fair bay for 5 or 10 weeks. The contemporary accounts are inconsistent. But once the leak was fixed and the ship floated and ready, the crew packed and stowed their ballast and then started on the first leg of the return journey back to England, and they went across the Pacific Ocean. But just before they sailed, Drake ceremoniously erected a firm post which he attached a metal plaque engraved with a formal land claim in the name of Queen Elizabeth for the territory they named Nova Albion. And so by the rules of the time, he had to do that. He had to stake a claim. So the theory that Drake landed in California was not always universally accepted. In the early 20th century, there were new clues to Drake's movements in the Pacific, and they came to light with the findings of anthropologist Celia Nuttall, who found a trove of contemporary documents about Drake's voyage and his actions and depredations in New Spain. she found that Drake actually landed on the northwest coast of America rather than the oft-cited California shore. And this was such a turnabout. The California historians tried to play it down because by then Drake was a hero to the Californians. This was the Golden State and he was their golden hero. Nuttall was born in San Francisco, so she grew up knowing about Drake. She was born in 1857 to a Hispanic mother and an Irish father. And then in 1864, the Nuttalls left for Europe, where she attended schools in France, Italy, Germany, and England, because her dad thought that she should, and her brother should know the languages of those countries. They returned to San Francisco in 1876, and in 1880, she married a French ethnologist and traveled with him to the West Indies and Europe. Though the marriage didn't last, her career as an anthropologist and archaeologist had begun. As she developed her thesis about the northern limits of Drake in the Pacific, she traveled to Cape Flattery, which is on the state of Washington, on the tip of the thumb of Washington. This is where several of the maps and manuscripts indicated Drake had been, including this map, which kind of shows that there was a few islands. This is where John Drake described a few islands, which might be the San Juan Islands. They were looking for the Strait of Anion, or the Northwest Passage. Here in Washington, she met the people of the Makah tribe, and she became convinced that she had found people like the ones that Drake encountered because of her cultural observations. She said that Drake said the people of at the landing had plank houses and canoes, but the Miwok, the Coast Miwok people in the Pomo along the California shoreline, where people generally believe Drake landed, live in grass houses that have willow bough frames, and they have Thule reed boats, which doesn't sound like canoes. And if Drake saw a canoe, I think he would have said canoe. And if he saw a Thule raft, I think he would have said a Thule raft. Just say. So Nuttall wrote this whole monograph on the northern limits of Drake in the Pacific, and she could never get it published. All the editorial boards turned her down, especially the ones in California. And so she took her ball and bat and went back to Mexico and had a great career in Mexico, and was not happy about the way she was treated in her home state of California. So Nuttall's work was never published, and except for an outline of her thesis, it's lost, and it was probably lost during the Blitz, because her brother had a house there and in London after she died, and all her papers were destroyed during the Blitz in London. Sadly, so sad. So let's first look at why there's so much confusion as to where Drake landed. The official account, the chapter in Hakluyt's book is the official account, published in 1589, that's 9 years after he returned. It described the northernmost limit of his voyage at only 42 degrees, which would be about southern Oregon, and the landing down at 38 degrees, which is around Drake's Bay, California. So that was the official account, and that's what everyone in California believed, and everyone was looking for Drake and his famous bay since the 1850s, somewhere around these latitudes. The California theorists put a lot of stock in this printed chapter of Hakluyt, and this is where the confusion of the landing began. The contention that I present here is that the official account was designed to claim more land than England was entitled. So if he came in up here and landed at 44 degrees, which was around Newport or Well Cove, I believe, then he couldn't have claimed this gap. So that's my contention. The account in Hakluyt's chapter describes Drake fulfilling the symbolic acts of sovereignty used by navigators, which included conducting a religious ceremony, marking the territory. He marked it with a metal plaque, the plate of brass, Drake's plate of brass, and conducting a symbolic ritual by which the ownership or sovereignty was obtained. And this was checked. This box was checked when the Native Americans put a crown on Drake, which was really a feather headdress. And Drake thought it meant that he was being crowned as king of the land, and it was just a gift, probably. There was a lot of miscommunication during the time he was here. So let's look at this. Given the surface winds in the Pacific are the same today, it would have been difficult for Drake and his square-sailed ship to sail close to the coast to reach a more northerly landing. The Hakluyt official account said he took what's called the Spanish course out to sea and then north to catch the wind. So here, if you look at any weather map, this is what the weather looks like in June, that was when he was sailing north. So it's really likely that he actually came in further north than, San Francisco Bay. And that's another little bit of evidence. So if Drake was up here at 48, like Zelia and et al. Believed, and then down to 44 for his landing, they had no right to this wide gap of land. And it was a trick in order to leave no gap of unclaimed territory, checking Spanish expansion on the coast. Would Drake do that? You betcha he would. So I found some proof of this idea. There's a manuscript now in the British Library. The provenience of it is that it was owned by a collector of manuscripts who died in 1628. This is a long time ago. And so we know the provenience is pretty good that it was from the time. It describes Drake's voyage, and it's an abstract from an original account written by someone on the voyage, but it's not signed and there's no name associated with it. So historians have known about this manuscript, but no one to date has figured out what I believe it is. This is a draft in progress of Hakluyt's official chapter, his official account. This is the draft before it went and got printed. So it's clearly a draft in progress. There's a number of crossouts, editorial notations in the margins. One piece of evidence that I found really compelling and very much supports the idea that the Harley manuscript, this manuscript is a draft of the official chapter, is that in the margin of the notes page, at the end of the document is a sketch of a pointing finger right here. And it says to put a bit of text about a Portuguese pilot into the main text. And so if you go and look in the other part of the text, there's only one mark of a pointing hand in the main text, and it's situated in the margin just below a sentence about Tom Moon taking a gold chain from a Spanish gentleman. As Tom Moon was the boatswain, Drake's boatswain. So when I looked in the official chapter, the editor's instruction was carried out, because position just after Moon takes the gold chain in the printed chapter, it's recited this text about the Portuguese pilot. So this was from an editor. So I was just bowled over that I had figured that out. Anyway, now British historian and geographer Eva Taylor picked up after Zelia and et al. Left off, and she challenged the Drake and California theory in a series of articles in the 1930s. She had by chance found the manuscript with the plans or plot of Drake's voyage. And you can see it's really burned, but it still retains most of the detailed instructions for the voyage, which called for Drake to pass through the Strait of Magellan, find lands not in the possession of the Spanish. And it's no small point that it was conducted with Queen Elizabeth's support. And we only figured that out in the 1930s with this document. I mean, Zelia et al. Said it had to have been because Drake wouldn't have left without a license from the Queen. But here we have his actual plan of the voyage. Taylor also discovered and published a passage from the private diary of Richard Maddox, who was the chaplain on the follow-up voyage. because there was pretty soon after there was another voyage that was going to go back to Nova Albion, but then it wrecked and the Spanish captured everybody aboard. But in this diary, there was a categorical statement that Drake reached 48 degrees north, which agreed with a later account by John Drake, who was also on the same voyage with Richard Maddox, and he got captured by the Spanish, who noted that they careened the Golden Hind at 44 degrees north. So Taylor wrote, "Now there can have been no possible reason for any falsification of the facts in a shipboard discussion or in a diary jotting meant for the writer's eye alone. Thus, it would appear that Drake's anchorage must be sought in Oregon rather than California." So she wrote this in the 30s. And she also found a word list in the Maddox document of the Native Americans who Drake met at the landing. And she showed this vocabulary to a linguist, an expert on Northwest Coast languages. And he came to the tentative conclusion that Drake encountered people who spoke a Chinookan language from the Northwest Coast. In particular, Peta, Drake wrote down as being a root, but I think it was Wapato, which is Peta's just another way of saying Wapato, which is an important root. And Drake recorded cheap as the root bread made from this root, which I think is chapel, which is the root bread in Chinook jargon. So like Nuttall, Eva Taylor's findings were not liked by the powers that be in California. So just as Taylor's work was changing the paradigm and the Northwest Coast theory of Drake's Landing was gaining traction, it was dramatically eclipsed when Drake's plate of brass was found on a hillside above San Francisco Bay and almost immediately hailed as a true artifact of Drake, his plate of brass land claim in the name of Queen Elizabeth. So this is the guy on the left is Shin. He's the one that found it. And the fellow on the right is Dr. Herbert Bolton, the historian, the famous historian at Berkeley, who authenticated the plate and said it's a real thing. But for years he had been telling his students, go out to Marin and look for Drake's plate of brass. I just know it's there, that's suspect in itself anyway. So I think Bolton made sort of an Easter egg hunt on an artifact that he had buried years before. He gave Shin a reward for finding it of $3,500, and this was during the Great Depression, or just at the end. And this would have been an incredible amount of money at the time, and it excited the public. They said, well, if he's giving that much money, it must be real. And so the plate didn't just put Bolton in the limelight. It attracted new students, bolstered private support for Bolton's programs. It sold newspapers because he was very closely tied with some newspaper magnates in the Bay Area, and it sold newspapers, so he got more favors from the newspapermen. So anyway, that's Bolton. So between 1937 and 1977, the Drake plate of brass was considered authentic by most people. But around the Bay Area, there was huge arguments over which bay was it that Drake landed in. So some people say it was Drake's Bay. Some people, there's a club that says it was Bolinas Lagoon. There's another group that says it was at San Quentin's Cove, and other people think it was just in San Francisco Bay itself. So there's been arguments and arguments for years, and it got really heated right before the 400th anniversary of Drake's voyage, which was in 1977, when they were going to commemorate it. So there we go. So this is anthropologist and archaeologist Robert Heiser. He was a professor at Berkeley, and he wrote in 1974 the following that I'm going to quote. In 1935 or 36, I had a course from Dr. Bolton at Berkeley, during which he talked about Drake. and pointed out that no one knew where he landed and told us to keep our eyes open for the brass plate, which he said he'd left, thinking that some Indian might have picked up this brass plate at Drake's Bay, where most people at the time seemed to think Drake landed. I suggested to Bolton that perhaps I might do some digging in the shell mounds and search for the plate. He was encouraging, and so we did carry out a good deal of digging. So Heiser didn't find anything. He found some ceramics, but he couldn't place them, and he thought they were from a later shipwreck. But they conducted over 30 excavations between 1937 and 1974 in and around Drake's Bay, San Francisco Bay, Bolinas Bay, the rock outcrop where the plate was found, and other locations, but as he noted, found nothing that could be associated with Drake the Englishman. So at Berkeley, Bolton was a very important man. He called his graduate students his Knights of the Round Table, and they were all men. And George Hammond, this fellow on the right, was one of his favorite students. And George later went on to become a history professor in various universities all over the US. And then later he went back to Berkeley and took over from Bolton as head of the great Bancroft Research Library, one of the best ones in the United States. But Bolton's empire was not an idyllic Camelot, and many of his colleagues disliked him. His detractors thought of him as a huckster and glory seeker who courted publicity. And two of his former grad students, who later became professors, became disillusioned with him, and they hated him like a snake. And there was no love lost between Zelia Nuttall and Bolton. Celia was in the anthropology department. She helped found the Berkeley Anthropology Department and helped hire Kroeber, the first anthropologist there. And in 1915, she presented her research about where Drake was on the northern limits of Drake in the Pacific at the big Panama Pacific Historical Congress of the American Historical Association, a big conference in San Francisco. And Bolton was one of the organizers. There was no love lost between the two. Her paper was met with coldness from Bolton and his colleagues, and her findings were ignored, just ignored. It's almost certain that Bolton himself initiated the plate of brass. My conjecture is that it was to be deployed if Nuttall's monograph got published and her theory got more traction. So the plate would confuse the issue. He would, arrange a finding, and it did confuse the issue when it was eventually launched in 1937 at the exact time when Eva Taylor was proposing a Northwest Coast landing and finding that the language was similar and so forth. So there's a lot of evidence that Bolton did it. He was the hoaxer. In 1977, this man, James Hart, made an investigation, or William Hart made an investigation. He was then director of the Bancroft Library, where the plate is still kept. The publicity of the investigation prompted a woman named Dolores Scoble to contact Hart and tell him what she knew about the plate. She said that when she was 12 or 13 years old, which was about 1917, her father, who was also a historian, took her and her mother to the home of a historian who lived in the hills above the Berkeley campus. There her dad met with the historian and two other men in the garage, while she and her mother met with the wife, and then she was asked to go play with the young children who lived there, while her mother visited with the historian's wife. At some point, Dolores left the company of the two kids and went out to see what the men were doing in the garage. I would do that. I think that's a normal thing. And she watched them and heard them laughing and discussing a metal plate. And she remembered that one of the men was a newspaper reporter. And after they left the house, her mother told her she was very unhappy about the plate and what they were planning, and that it was sort of a joke about Drake claiming land. So a 12-year-old girl would remember this kind of thing and especially because her mother was so unhappy about it. And among the revelations was that the plate was initiated by this Berkeley area historian in 1917. And even though these events took place 20 years prior to the eventual launch of the hoax, which was on the heels of Eva Taylor, it was manufactured at the critical moment when when Zelia Nuttall's theory was gaining some traction. So I looked into Bolton and I found he was the author of other hoaxes and untrue things. So there was a lot of treasure involved. I searched newspaper archives and went through his own files at the Bancroft, and on several occasions he authenticated Spanish treasure maps and made claims that he found important documents describing lost gold or silver mines. The schemes usually involved him being paid to translate a Spanish manuscript or treasure map, and he called up all his newspaper friends to tell them about the latest find, and these were put on the front page, and so they sold a lot of newspapers, so everyone had their bread buttered. In part, Bolton's reputation was made by these schemes, and even in his obituary, they described that he translated things for treasure maps, but when I looked into it, there was never any treasure found, even though he said there was not. So here is another hoax that I have found is a hoax. This is the Dare Stone. It was found, allegedly found near Roanoke, and it demonstrated that the lost colony of Roanoke actually moved inland, and this stone was, everyone wonders if this is an authentic stone or not, and I can say it is not authentic. This stone was found in 1937, just a few months after the Drake plate of brass was brought to Bolton. This kind of made me wonder. And it was brought to a history professor at Emory in Atlanta. The inscription on the stone and the message written was by a member of the English colony of Roanoke, and it supposedly solved the mystery of the lost colony by saying they moved inland, and most of the people of the colony were killed by savages. The Emory history professor declared it authentic, just like Bolton had declared the plate of brass authentic. And the man who found the stone said his name was L.E. Hammond. This is the same strange method of operation employed by Bolton, but the man who found the stone, L.E. Hammond, signed over the stone in documents witnessed by a notary public who required a form of ID. And I think the hoaxers used a notary because this made it seem official, and lent credibility to the alleged artifact. And Mr. Hammond was awarded $500 or maybe $1,000. They're not, it's different in every place I look. And the money was sent to a general delivery post office box in Oakland. Now, Oakland is virtually next door to Berkeley. So there was some money sent to Berkeley, and then no one watched who picked up the money. L.E. Hammond disappeared, and they couldn't find him. They even sent the Pinkerton Detective Agency out to California to look for him, and his story did not check out. He said he was a vegetable dealer who lived in Pasadena and then retired in Alameda County by Berkeley, but they couldn't find him. They could not find him. So Emory officials of the Emory University thought it was suspect, and so they sent the Pinkerton Agency out to Oakland and to LA in search of Mr. Hammond. So I compared the signatures of George Hammond, Bolton's star student, remember I showed you his picture, and by then a history professor in New Mexico, and the mysterious disappearing L.E. Hammond. So here is George Hammond, a famous history professor, and here is L.E. Hammond. They had to do 4 copies of the contract, and it's the same signature. And I had handwriting analysis look at it, and 3 of the 4 said, yes, it's the same person. The 4th one apparently is always hired by the prosecutors in court cases, and he always says, no, you can't use any handwriting analysis. I didn't know that at the time that I wrote my book, but now I do. But anyway, the money was sent to Oakland while George Hammond was in Albuquerque, where he was not only chair of the history department, but he was the dean of the graduate school. So in 1946, with Bolton's blessing, George was appointed director of the Bancroft Library. And after Hammond retired, he continued to maintain an office there until the 1980s. He even served as chairman of a session of the Conference on Sir Francis Drake in 1979. So that's George Hammond, the well-respected George Hammond, history professor, former director of the Bancroft Library. And I figured out that he was also a hoaxer. Though he wrote many books, he was well-respected, but it's just awful what he did anyway. So Shakespearean scholars suggest that the circumnavigations by Drake and later by Cavendish were such triumphs for England that Shakespeare named the Globe Theatre after these voyages as a commemoration. And additionally, the narrative of the events at the Fair and Good Bay may have provided the playwright with inspiration for The Tempest, which began with a storm and a shipwreck and featured a native who worshipped the new arrivals as brave gods bearing celestial gifts. This is a statue of Drake that's in Plymouth, England. Celia Nuttall and Eva Taylor trespassed on the high ground of a California myth and found that to take Drake out of California was akin to pulling up the redwoods. The Northwest Coast theory of Drake's landing is at present still unimaginable to many scholars. An uncritical acceptance of the dominant paradigm of a California landing is understandably the norm. Recently, Drake's Bay was made a national landmark, in part because of the association or alleged association of Drake with that piece of land. So in view of the very important and deeply interesting problems involved, this question of where Drake and company landed and repaired the Golden Hind deserves to be fully reconsidered. So thank you. End show.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it. That was great. So now's the time. I'm gonna ask for some questions if anyone has anything. I don't see anything in the chat. Oh, here we go. Let's see. Was the medallion analyzed using modern methods by reliable labs?
The plate of brass, yes, it was. They did it in 1938, but it wasn't a very reliable analysis at the time. In fact, the guy who analyzed it thought it was like a holy relic, so he was very afraid of even cutting into it. So it took him a year to even analyze it. But in 1977, it was reanalyzed, and it is definitely not an old piece of brass.
All right. And the next question is, what can you say about your ongoing investigations or excavations?
Well, now I'm following up on the Chowan River Dare Stone. I'm doing some more research into that to find out more about Hammond and why he would do that, and trying to nail down some of that a little more. I did a small excavation at Whale Cove where I think he landed, but there was a tsunami in 1700 that really came over the bluff there and totally topsy-turvied some of the sediments, and so that would, it might have wiped out any camp or anything that might have been left by Drake. But there might be, maybe in the future we'll do some more excavation farther up. But I do think he was at Whale Cove, but I'm not 100% sure. And we only have circumstantial evidence, so we need to find something really, in context. And I just thought, Chelsea, what would be the smoking gun? I know that Drake had little silver spoons with acorns on them. That would be the most important thing if we found one of those, or a coin or something, or the real plate of brass, which is probably made out of copper, not brass. But I think something will come up someday, and maybe something already has, and we just don't recognize it. So.
All right, next question. Have you been invited to present any programs in California on Drake since the book came out last year?
Yeah, I gave one at the Sausalito Boat Club. They were very excited about it because one of their members had read my book and was like blown away with my findings. So I gave a talk there. And then I was invited to Berkeley, the anthropology department. And I told them that, that the history professors there were both hoaxers, and they had a laugh of it because I guess there's some rivalry between it, but it's still not like totally accepted. But my book came out right on the verge of COVID, and so my book tour was canceled. And I only went to Berkeley, and then COVID shut everything down. And I'm getting a lot of pushback from California, but it's just the way it is.
All right, and we had another comment about the earthquake dropped elevation several feet. The campsite could be offshore. Have you ever thought about doing any like marine archaeology to look offshore for sites or any kind of evidence?
Well, that's super expensive, first of all. And secondly, there was a shipwreck there. Whale Cove was a bootlegger bay, and there was a shipwreck at the mouth there, and the ship burned and wrecked, and there's pieces of the ship that still washed out. So how could you sort out an Elizabethan campsite from all the clutter and static that this shipwreck left? Also, people used to dump off the cliff there, and there's old cars and stuff buried in the sand. I mean, it's a beautiful place now, but there's metal all around deeply in there. And I just think it would be just really hard to figure out,
We had another question about the ship itself, and does it still exist, and would there be a way to analyze the wood on the keel to make any more determinations about location?
No, the ship does not exist. It was made into a monument shortly after he returned. Out of the 5 ships that first set sail, the Golden Hind was the only one that made it back. The others wrecked or were broken up for firewood or something. But we know where it was as a monument, and it sunk into the water, and there might be like a shell of it, like an indicator of how big it was, because we're still not clear on how big it was. So it might be there, but the one thing that might help us is when Drake was on the coast, the Native Americans gave him long chains of shell beads, and he went back to Buckland Abbey, and maybe the necklace broke and he swept one out, and maybe at Buckland we can find a little bit of shell and analyze the source of it. I don't know, that's probably grasping at straws. But there is a replica ship called the Golden Hind 2, which is in London, and I've met the captain there, Roddy Coleman, and he's a jolly old fellow. And they use it as a museum, and kids groups go through there, and then you can rent it at night for weddings or parties. It's just a great ship. But Roddy insisted it's the same size as the original Golden Hind. So check it out next time you're in London.
All right, and we had another comment about, let's see, it seems that they had to use the tide and the beach to refloat the boat. Could this also give a clue?
I was thinking that I'd go back and see what the tides would have been like back then. But I don't know enough about careening to know if that would have been enough. And very few people know about careening because no one turns wooden ships over anymore. So it would be getting an expert in and really kind of analyzing it that way. But they were very good seamen and navigators, and they knew how to handle their ship. So I think it could have been careened there. And certainly the bay was wide enough for them to get in. That's one of the things the Californians keep saying is, oh, the mouth of the bay is too narrow for a huge ship like that. Well, the ship was not that big. The ship was not that big. It wasn't like a galleon, like a Spanish galleon. It was like 80 feet long, maybe 30 or 40 feet wide, and it could have slipped in pretty well. So I think they could have done it. He was a pirate. Drake knew how to do those things.
And also a question about, have you explored all possible libraries in Europe or elsewhere where old records of Drake's voyage might reside?
No, I think there's probably more manuscripts out there because they keep finding manuscripts. I didn't get to go through the archives at Plymouth, and I know that they have a lot of contemporary manuscripts, and there might be some scrap in there, but part of it is I can't read old Elizabethan writing. Like when I figured out that one manuscript was a chapter, I can't read any of that. I had to have the printed version and go through word by word to see what it was saying, and because there is a printed version of it, and it's basically I had to translate it almost, and I had a woman in England help me with that too. But I think once the word gets out, people in England are and other places, maybe even in Spain, are going to start looking for maps and things, and maybe we'll find some more things. So I hope the word gets out more. People start looking.
And it looks like one last question. Are there any stories or legends from Northwest tribes about Drake?
No. But I don't think they knew it was Drake. I mean, I don't think they understood that it was just human beings from another land. I think that they thought that this entity that came into their bay was a god, the god Thunder, and that's from some of their oral history, and that's where I get the title to the book, this Thunder Go North. So you could read that chapter and understand that. But there's talking to the contemporary Native Americans now and tribal members, they don't know what to think about it.
All right, gonna do one last call. Does anybody else have any questions for the evening? All right, Melissa, thank you very,
Thanks.
very much. This is great. Thank you.
And if anyone wants a book, they can contact me and I'll get it to them. I have one book left of the case that I had, so.
Awesome.
Thanks, Melissa.
Oh, thank you, David. Thanks for having me. Take care, everybody. I'm leaving now.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Melissa. Good presentation.